Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we'll be covering how to periodize hypertrophy training for long-term muscle growth. Before exploring how hypertrophy training can be periodized, we first need to establish a baseline training program that we can apply the periodization concepts to. This program will essentially be a mesocycle or block of training. Let's now create this mesocycle and then apply the periodization principles to later in the video. The first consideration when creating a hypertrophy mesocycle is the overall structure of the program. This refers to how long the block will be and how many overloading weeks will be performed before a deload week. Generally, 3 to 5 weeks of overloading training can usually be performed before a deload is required. Beginner trainees can usually get away with longer durations of overloading training before a deload is required, while more experienced trainees usually require more frequent deloads. Let's use an example trainee to create a hypertrophy program and periodize this throughout the video. For this example, we will include 3 weeks of overloading training with a 1-week deload. The deload will be placed at the beginning of the mesocycle so that it also acts as a familiarization week. This will allow the trainee to get a feel for the new exercises or loads if they are being implemented into the mesocycle. Next, we need to establish how much volume will be performed per muscle group per week. Establishing how much volume is best requires trial and error, and optimal volumes may also change over time. Here are some general recommendations of how much volume may be ideal for muscle growth. To understand the relationship between volume and hypertrophy in more detail, you can find the video on this channel titled "How much volume is best for muscle growth?" Based on these guidelines, let's now select some volumes for each muscle group for our example trainee. The volumes that an individual selects should reflect the muscle groups they want to emphasize. So if a trainee wants to emphasize growth of a specific muscle group, then the higher end of the previous volume recommendations can be included. For this example, we've chosen 16 sets for the chest, 14 sets for the back, 12 sets for the quads, 12 sets for the hamstrings, 20 sets for the biceps, and 18 sets for the triceps. The next step is to select exercises for the relevant muscle groups. For this example, we've selected the following exercises. For the chest, we will use the flat barbell bench press, the incline dumbbell bench press, and the cable chest flies. For the back, we've chosen the bent over row and the lat pull down. For the quads, we have the leg press and the leg extension machine. For the hamstrings, we have the stiff leg deadlift and the hamstring curl machine. For the biceps, we will already get some volume from the back exercises, but dumbbell curls have also been included for some direct training. And for the triceps, pushdowns have been included in addition to the compound pressing exercises. The next variable to consider is the proximity to failure of each set. The proximity to failure refers to how close to failure a given set is taken. This is an important variable to consider for hypertrophy training, since sets need to be taken quite close to failure to stimulate all muscle fibers. Proximity to failure is generally quantified using the RPE or RIR scale. This is a numerical scale which allows trainees to rate a set based on how many reps they could have performed before failure. To learn more about how to use RPE and RIR for hypertrophy training, you can find the video on this channel titled "Using RPE for Hypertrophy Programming and Periodization." For best hypertrophy adaptations, sets need to be taken to at least 4 reps in reserve or an RPE of 6. Sets should also only reach complete failure very infrequently and mostly for isolation exercises rather than compound lifts. So RPE should generally be prescribed in the ranges of 6 to 10, or in other words, an RIR of 0 to 4. The next variable to consider is training frequency. For hypertrophy training, training frequency refers to how many times per week a muscle group will be trained. Training frequency does not seem to significantly influence muscle growth when total weekly volume is equated. So frequency is a method of organizing a training program rather than actually influencing hypertrophy itself. For most muscle groups, a frequency of 1 to 3 times per week is a good general guideline. Smaller muscle groups can generally be trained with higher volumes and therefore higher frequencies, while larger muscle groups generally cannot handle the same volume and frequency. For this example, we will use a 4-day training split, with each muscle group being trained twice per week. On days 1 and 3, the quads, chest, and triceps will be trained, while on days 2 and 4, the back, hamstrings, and biceps will be targeted. And the last variable to program is the load and rep ranges. The reason these two factors are considered one variable is because the load will determine the rep ranges used. Since the proximity to failure will already be prescribed, heavier loads will mean that less reps are performed, while lighter loads will mean that more reps can be performed before reaching the RPE threshold. So the question becomes, what loads should be used to target what rep ranges? The answer to this is quite simple. It doesn't really matter. Any load that is taken close enough to failure will produce equal hypertrophy outcomes. However, loads which cause reps to drop below around 8 appear to be inferior for muscle growth. So practically speaking, rep ranges anywhere between 8 and 20 are all suitable to induce hypertrophy. There are also some general guidelines which may help a trainee determine exactly what load will be used. Generally speaking, compound lifts are better suited to heavier loads with lower rep ranges, while isolation exercises are better suited to lighter loads with higher rep ranges. Heavier loads will also place more stress on the joints and connective tissue than lighter loads. So trainees who have a specific joint issue or a history of pain in a certain joint may want to use lighter loads with higher rep ranges for the muscle groups surrounding that joint. Let's now put all these training variables together to create a complete 5-week training block. Firstly, we can see here that the program has 3 overloading weeks with 1 deload week at the beginning of the program. The deload week has a lower number of sets for each exercise than the following 3 weeks. This is a volume reduction of around 1/3 to allow recovery from the previous training block. We have also implemented the exercises that were chosen over the 4-day split. These are split between the 4 sessions to target each muscle group twice per week. The volume has been dispersed between the exercises to achieve the total desired volume for each muscle group. This volume remains the same for each week, except for the first week since it is the deload. And the proximity to failure has been prescribed via increasing RIR over the training block. We can see here that the RIRs range from 4 to 1 for the compound lifts and 3 to 0 for the isolation exercises. Lastly, loads have also been selected which are specific to the individual and what rep ranges they want to perform each exercise in. These loads remain the same for the entire training block, while the RIR increases. This will naturally increase the number of reps performed for each set of each exercise because the trainee is taking each set closer and closer to failure. We can also see here that the loads undulate each time a muscle group is trained. This means that one session uses a lighter load while the other session uses a heavier load. This will alter the number of reps performed, providing a slight variation to each training session. Now that we've created a basic training mesocycle, we can explore how to periodize this mesocycle over time. Once a trainee has completed this initial training program, we now need to progress the program to see continual adaptations. There are many ways to do this, and we will now explore a few of these methods. The first method that we can implement is to simply change nothing at all. Once an athlete has completed a mesocycle, if they maintain the same number of sets with the same load and the same proximity to failure, they may be able to repeat this and see further improvements in performance. For example, let's say that a trainee performs the following number of reps for the bent row exercise for the first training block. We can see here that the reps performed increases over the weeks since the RIR increases. In the next training block, we may keep all variables the same and the trainee is able to perform more reps than the previous block since they now have become bigger and stronger. So even though nothing was changed, the trainee has still progressed. The second method of progression is to increase load. The load should only be increased slightly so that rep ranges don't drop down too low. If a trainee is adapting well and rep ranges are getting very high, they may consider increasing the load in the next block. This will cause reps to drop lower, so if reps drop below around an 8 on average for compound lifts or a 10 on average for isolation exercises, then load probably shouldn't increase. An example of how this can be implemented may look something like this. The trainee may have performed the bent row exercise with a load of 75 kilos in the first block. In the next block, they may increase the load to 80 kilos. This will naturally cause reps to drop, but since they didn't drop below 8 reps on average, then this load is fine to implement. The next method of progression is to change the exercise. This should not be done with every new mesocycle, otherwise the trainee will not get the most out of each exercise. The exercise should only be changed if progress is stalled on a particular lift, and the trainee is no longer seeing progression from mesocycle to mesocycle. If this is the case, the trainee can swap this exercise for a similar exercise targeting the same muscle groups. For example, let's say the trainee has plateaued in the bent row exercise, as we can see here in this example. A different exercise may now need to replace the bent row to continue seeing further progress. A seated cable row may be selected, since this will target the back muscles just as the bent over row did. The trainee can now progress using the other methods of progression for another 2 to 5 mesocycles. The last method of progression that can be applied is to increase the weekly volume for that particular muscle group. This should only be implemented if the trainee has exhausted all the other options and is still failing to see adequate improvement in performance. An extra set or two may be dispersed between the exercises which target a certain muscle group. For example, let's say that this trainee has plateaued in most exercises for their back. They can perform an additional 2 sets per week for the back to provide additional volume. So we have gone from 14 sets of back training in the first block to 16 sets of back training in the second block. This is a last resort method of progression and shouldn't be implemented frequently. The more volume that a trainee performs, the more the body adapts to it. Therefore, the trainee actually becomes less sensitive to increases in volume, and excessive amounts result in minimal additional muscle growth. Every 6 to 12 mesocycles, a resensitization period may be required to allow the trainee to become more responsive to muscle growth once again. The resensitization period should consist of a short mesocycle only performing around 50% of the regular volume that was previously trained with. For example, the trainee may employ a 4-week mesocycle with around half the volume for each muscle group than what was previously performed. So we can see here that the back only has 8 sets in the second block rather than the usual 14 as we have in the first block. Let's now explore how utilizing these progression methods may look from a long-term perspective. Generally, hypertrophy training probably shouldn't be rigidly periodized because it is almost impossible to predict how you will respond to training. You can't anticipate when you will plateau with a certain exercise, or how well you can recover from a certain amount of volume. Therefore, it is best to use a reactive approach to training. This means using each method of progression when it is required. We will now cover how back training may look over 10 mesocycles, using the same example trainee as the previous examples. So as established previously, we will start the training block with 14 sets per week using the bent row and lat pull down exercises. In the second block, training may be progressing well, so all variables have been maintained. In the third block, the load has been increased since the trainee is still progressing well and the rep ranges may be getting too high. The load has again been increased in the fourth block as the trainee is getting stronger once again. In the fifth block, the trainee may be starting to plateau in the bent row exercise, or they simply want some variation in their training, so the bent row has been replaced with a seated row. Since there is now a new exercise, the trainee has more room to progress, so all variables have been maintained in the 6th block. In the 7th block, the load has been increased since they now have become stronger at the new exercise. In the 8th block, progress may be stalling again, so rather than change the exercise, the volume has been increased to 16 sets per week. Load is added once again in the 9th block, with a maintenance in this additional volume. However, progress may be plateauing, and it is time for a resensitization period where volume has been reduced to 8 sets per week. This will allow the trainee to become more receptive to volume in subsequent blocks. This whole process can then be repeated once again, and progress can be continued for years on end. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.